Hello there, Mr. Lee here, and welcome to this video on Plutarch. Plutarch is a biographer and he wrote Parallel Lives, one chapter of which we'll need to study as part of our course on myth and religion, specifically the topic of foundation stories. Plutarch was Greek and he was born in Boeotia in Greece before 50 AD and he died after 120 AD. The reason why it says before and after is because we know he did certain things in his life and he must have been born before that time he did something. And the last thing he did, we didn't really have a record of when he died. So we just kind of know he died after the last thing that we have a record of he did. The most important thing that he has done is probably to serve as a priest of Apollo in Delphi from about 90 AD onwards. But fundamentally, what's interesting about him is that he's lived in Greece for most, if not all, of his life, and he's writing from a Greek perspective. By the time you read Plutarch, you've probably read the Livy texts already, and Livy was around at a time where Roman history was a little bit turbulent. There was a civil war going on. Well, Plutarch lived and wrote a bit after this time, and things are less turbulent at the time of Livy. On the slide, you can see three major events that happened, but generally, this is a calmer, more peaceful time for most Romans. And this perhaps allowed him the time to write. And writing he did. He wrote the Parallel Lives, in which the book is divided into chapters, where in each chapter a famous Greek is compared to a famous Roman. Generally, the people chosen to put in the same chapter have similar achievements, similar background, similar attributes, and so on. For example, in one of the chapters, he's put Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar together. They're both great generals and politicians to an extent, and that allows for a more easy and more interesting comparison. The chapter that we need to know as part of the Foundations Stories topic is the chapter where Theseus is compared to Romulus. And you may even have studied a bit about Theseus and Romulus already earlier in this topic. Now, Plutarch is a very learned person. He writes a lot and he reads a lot and he uses different sources. He has access to that because under the Roman Empire, there starts to be copies of books that came before, documenting different stories from different places. So Plutarch has access to all that. And so he works a little bit more like a modern historian compared to Livy. He also uses Livy as a source since Livy came before him. So whilst you might have read Livy as a source for Romulus and Remus, you can trust that Plutarch would have read that and used part of those information in his comparison of Theseus and Romulus. Comparing Theseus and Romulus, he did. He talked about the upbringing of each character, the fortunes that they have, the way that they choose to or had to deal with the adversities and difficulties that is put in their way, as well as how they treated their subjects, I mean, people who follow them as a leader, as well as women and the gods. I guess if you're looking for comparisons, you've got to have different factors to compare against. And in the 6 chapters that we're going to read, which is on the next page, he picks out different factors with which to compare the two characters. And quite often within those chapters, he actually picks which person is the best person. He says Theseus excels in this aspect and Romulus excels in this aspect. Why do we read Parallel Lives then? I suppose you have to read it as part of your course, so that is important. And one thing that isn't mentioned here is that you're quite likely to have to compare different heroes that we've studied. So it might be Theseus with Romulus, but it might even be Theseus and Heracles, or perhaps even Romulus and Heracles, a mix and mishmash of all the different heroic characters that we have to study. But I suppose the other reasons why you might read parallel lives are also reasons why you might study this subject. The Romans and the Greeks enjoy debates and discussions and parallel lives and having pairs of characters and discussing who's greater. That naturally lends itself to topics of discussions and debates, perhaps after a dinner in Greek and Roman tables, if they were couches, perhaps just in a public context, perhaps in a school. So they provide materials for debates. For me, though, I think what is also interesting is we tend to think of the Greeks being around at the time of 400 BC, because that's when the Greek Empire, Athens, is at its peak. Or we think of the Romans as the people around the year zero, and because that's when the Roman Empire was formed, and perhaps it was at its greatest extent. But it's really interesting reading what a Greek person wrote at the height of the Roman Empire. And so it just gives us a little bit of a different perspective on history. Yes, he is a subject of the Roman Empire, but he's ethnically Greek, and he's writing comparing the Greeks and the Romans, so the people of his own culture, over the people who rule over the Mediterranean, including their own homeland. And the final reason why you might want to read Parallel Lives is because it focuses on the person rather than events. We often think of history as this happened, this happened, this happened, or this person made this happen. But here it actually allows us to consider a person as a whole, or indeed two people as a whole. And I think that's also a different dimension, right? Plutarch gives us a Greek dimension in Greek and Roman history and mythology, and he also gives us a insight into the person or persons behind each of these stories. It makes for an interesting reading, and I hope if you have time, you will not just read the chapter that we have to read and read it broadly, and perhaps one day you might be able to discuss this, much like the Greeks and Romans did, over a cup of coffee or something stronger. And so this is a brief introduction to Plutarch and parallel lives.